and solo sonatas or duo sonatas. So the classical period saw the rise of the pianoforte as the most important instrument and became really dominant in the 19th century. And so Beethoven wrote 32 piano sonatas that stand above the entire literature. But there were also sonatas for violin and piano, or for flute and piano, or whatever the combination would be. Those are called duo sonatas. But these are all examples of sonata cycle works. And so that term sonata was used in the Baroque period, and that saw then Baroque types of sonatas, but they weren't writing symphonies, and they weren't writing sonata-allegro movements in the Baroque period. This is something that's a classical period development. So the symphony then, in the classical era, it had certain expectations. So you expected, and so classical symphony then will refer to symphonies that were written by the Viennese classical composers. So who were they again? I just went over that. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. So go ahead and get those four composers in mind, because we're going to talk about three of them in this first section on the symphony. But, so when I say classical symphony, that's what we're talking about, symphonies by those composers. They typically would have four movements. So that's the norm. Not everyone did. You could have a three-movement symphony. Beethoven wrote a five-movement symphony. But in general, four movements was the pattern. And typically, the first movement will be a fast movement. That term sonata-allegro form was associated with the first movement of a classical symphony. And so it has to do with this idea that it's an instrumental work. That's what sonata means. And then allegro has to do with the tempo. So that was a typical tempo of the first movement, was allegro. So that's the expectation. It would obviously be in tonic, so in home key, and would use sonata-allegro form. All right, the second movement then would be the slow movement. It would be in contrasting key, so it wouldn't be in the home key, so it would not be in tonic. As far as the form goes, it wasn't as specific as what you would expect in the first movement. Almost all classical symphony first movements are sonata-allegro form. The second movement, though, it could be sonata-allegro form. We'll see that in Mozart Prague Symphony second movement that we do. So I'll just put there SA. But you can also find examples of theme and variation. Or you can find examples of rondo patterns. So like a ternary ABA pattern, that's a type of rondo. So there are different types of rondos depending on the number of times that the rondo theme is presented. But we'll look at some examples of rondo form. But that's the third possibility. So you have those three possibilities for the form of the second movement. The third movement of the Classical Symphony then is the dance movement. This was something that was continued from the collection of dances that composers would write in the Baroque period. So a Bach violin partita would be a collection of dances. And so you have dances like the Allemande and the Courante and the Sarabande and the Gigue. And one of the optional dances that's included in a Baroque suite was a minuet. And they would couple together, minuet 1, minuet 2. So the idea of paired dances was a popular Baroque practice. And so the third movement was a moderate tempo. So something that was middle, and it would be in the tonic key. And the form is the form that's known as minuet and trio. So there are certain specific expectations associated with that. So with Haydn and Mozart, their third movements would typically be minuet and trio. With Beethoven then, Beethoven is, as is Schubert. These two composers are seen as composers who make the transition from classicism into the 19th century romanticism. And one of the things that Beethoven did, which was romantic, was the use of a scherzo movement instead of a minuet movement. So scherzo trio then is something that arose with the Beethoven symphonies. The scherzo was faster, more of a feeling of one beat per measure. And it was more emotional, whether it was something that was comical, if it's in a major key, or ironic, or in a minor key, it would be much more dramatic. So that also, I'll put here, scherzo. So it's S-C-H-E-R-Z-O, there's no T in it. And this scherzo and trio is associated with Beethoven. And then later composers who wrote romantic symphonies would typically write scherzo movements like Brahms. All right. Fourth movement then was a concluding fast movement. It also, of course, be in tonic. And the last movement wasn't as specific as far as the form goes. So you have real specific expectations of the first movement and of the third movement. But the second movement and the fourth movement have these three possibilities. So it's the same possibilities for form in the fourth movement as you will find in the second movement. So you can find examples of sonata-allegro, theme variation, or rondo. And so those are specific expectations in a classical symphony. Four movements, and they have these different tempos and keys and forms associated with them. So you need to know this for this first section on symphony. Okay, so this is the basic framework that you have in mind, that if you are going to listen to a Haydn symphony, this is what you're expecting to see. You always compare things then to the classical model. If things are different, then you make a comment about that. Well, it's not doing, what's the typical, for this style. So that's the thing about classicism, is that you can describe things that are, expected. It's more objective in general as far as stylistic characteristics. All right. Okay, another thing that is has a certain expectation, it has to do with the instrumentation for a classical symphony. And so they would write for a specific combination of instruments. And so somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 players for a Mozart symphony. About 2/3 of those would be strings. But when you view the score, you're going to see the very top 4 staves are bracketed together, and those are the woodwinds. So you would have paired woodwinds, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, and 2 bassoons. So that's the woodwind section. Then next down the page, as you're looking at your score, you'll find the brass, which would be 2 French horns and 2 trumpets. All right, next on the score, you'll see then the percussion, which would be timpani. And so you have 2 kettle drums that are tuned to tonic and dominant. And they're played by 1 player, of course. And then, as I said, about 2/3 of the players are strings. And so the strings are divided into 4 parts. So you have first violin, second violin, violas, and then the lower strings would share the same part, the cello and the basses. So that's the typical classical orchestration that you expect. So you need to learn that, because this is then what's the basis for the symphony. And all symphonies are compared to this classical model. So the Romantic era just developed from the classical era. And there are way more things that are in common that are different between classicism and romanticism. But it's always the classical model that is the basis for making comparison in individual works. All right, so sonata-allegro form, as I mentioned, is a form that emerges. So it emerges in the classical era, and it is a form that has its roots in the Baroque period. Most specifically, it's an elaboration on binary and rounded binary movements, which were associated with dance movements. So it's something that developed from dance music. And a lot of the classical rhythms are related to Baroque dance types. And so one of the charts that I'm going to ask you to be able to discuss is, look on page 229 of the text. I believe that's the page number. And it's a comparison of classical and romantic characteristics. Is that the right page number?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so page 229. You want to go ahead and start to just read through this chart, because what this does is to discuss different aspects of music. So we'll talk about melodic characteristics, or harmonic, or rhythmic, or texture, or form, or the use of emotion, and so forth, okay? So look at that chart. And what I'll do on this first pass is I will just give you that chart. I'm going to have you fill it in. Okay, so go ahead and start to study this and become comfortable with it. And this is the basis then for the way that you will write about musical forms, that you'll describe with an example that you see what are melodic characteristics. And so we'll use terms like conjunct or disjunct. So I'll get into that here in a minute. But at any rate, that chart is important. And so this sonata-allegro form is something that developed from dance music. So I'll try to dance. And so the reason, one of the features of binary form, as you would expect, it's in two sections. And so you basically have two sections that are enclosed with double bars and repeats. And so the earliest examples of sonata-allegro form would have repeats around the second section, which was longer than the first section. And eventually, though, these were discontinued. And so for your basic model for sonata-allegro form, we're just going to include the repeat signs around the first section. So the first section is called the exposition. And the exposition is the statement of the main themes of the movement, which will be restated at the end and which will be discussed and developed in the middle section. So there are certain keys that you expect in a classical sonata-allegro movement. So the opening theme we'll describe as the A theme. So either a major or minor key. And we're going to see that there are 4 different labels that we're going to apply to these 4 sections in the exposition. Everything that is in the opening tonic key we'll describe as being A theme. There may be, several different motives or, ideas that are expressed depending on the scope of the work. But you'll have then a section that is a modulating section that's called a transition. And so this section would then be modulating to a closely related key. If it's in a major key, you expect it to go to dominant. So this transition would modulate, and so if you're in the key of C major, what key would you expect it to go to? G major. And so the composer is going to start to introduce F sharps into the music. And so you have that ultratone. That's what makes it sound like it's going to the dominant key. It'll then cadence in that key and confirm that new key. Then what follows will be the B theme. Okay? So that's the third place, is the B theme. And if it's in a minor key, what you expect is that it would go to the relative major key.